Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I say good morning or good afternoon because we usually have a lot of people from different places joining us. Today, so far, I've seen people from Cranfield University, some people from, I think, Australia, Denmark, Newcastle, the UK, Stellenbosch. We have people from Stellenbosch as well. So it's always nice to welcome a number of international attendants. And we're focusing today in a market that has been really important in renewable energy development. And we have been focused on it for many years. It was a very interesting market, as you know, South Africa. And now we've hit a few years of less development, as we know. But yesterday, all of a sudden, the draft of the Integrated Resource Plan has come out. So there's been a little bit of movement, and we have Chris and Pancho with us today who are going to tell us about this Integrated Resource Plan. Believe me, we put this webinar up about 3 or 4 months ago. We had no idea these were the dates, but we've been quite lucky that all of this information has come out now from the government. So before we start, I'd just like to ask Chris to very briefly introduce himself and tell us where he's joining from. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Belen. This is Chris from Cape Town, South Africa, and I can give you more background on myself when I give my presentation.
Thank you very much, Chris. So Pancho, where are you joining us from today? And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm joining you from Johannesburg, and I will have a chat to you and you get to know a little bit more about myself.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. So I can see also people from South Africa, from South Korea. Anyway, welcome everyone. This is what we're going to do. Chris is going to speak first and he's going to share his screen. Then Pancho is going to speak. Then after that, we're going to have a Q&A session. So Chris, you can prepare your screen up if you want whilst I talk. You can send us your questions through the Q&A box, which is at the bottom. Okay, we will take as many as we can in the end about that. And anything else that you need, I'm here. You can also find me on the chat. So once Chris is ready, then we'll start with him. And prepare your questions, ladies and gentlemen, because looks like the South African market is about to become as well. Go for it, Chris.
Okay. Can you see my screen okay? Is it just one slide that you see now?
It's not big yet. You have to press, swap% review and slideshow.
Is that working now? Okay.
Now. Yes. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for the intro, Belen. Just to reiterate, I'm going to be speaking about the status and opportunities for the solar energy industry in South Africa. And I'll focus a bit more on the solar PV sector. And Pancho will cover more of the CSP industry as well as some of the other renewable energy technologies. So just some more background on myself. I've been consulting in the energy industry for over 10 years. And I moved from the US to South Africa back in 2010. So you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not originally from South Africa. But it's been great to see the industry grow from almost nothing to where it is now, which is over 6 gigawatts of renewable energy projects that have been procured and more on the way. I work with a wide range of clients from the public sector to the private sector on from writing policy to market research to investment analysis, depending on the client needs. And to best understand the solar PV opportunities in South Africa, I think it's helpful to look at the different market segments. So starting larger at the utility scale down to the rooftop and even off-grid sector. And that's kind of how I broke up this presentation as well. It sounds like there's a broad mix of people on this call. So I'll just give a quick background on the history since some people may not be as familiar with it. But South Africa's procurement program began back in 2011 for renewable energy. And to date, we've procured over 6 gigawatts from over 90 renewable energy projects, mostly wind and solar. Most of the projects from through round three are already up and operational, with some exceptions to a CSP project. And there was a several-year delay for round 4 due to the utility refusing to sign the PPAs and also some government challenges we were having during that time. But Now, as of early this year, we have a new president and the new Minister of Energy, and they helped get the PPAs signed for round 4. So that was very welcome to see that go through earlier this year, and it's the industry's picking up again, which is positive. And the government also committed to finalizing this integrated resource plan, or at least publishing it by August, and they kept that deadline as it just came out yesterday. So to better understand the utility scale options, you really have to dig into the detail of this draft resource plan. So while the demand has decreased since over the last few years, since 2007, the draft integrated resource plan projects that it's going to start increasing again out to 2030 and beyond. It also ran a number of different scenarios for the resource plan, from least cost approach to a policy adjusted scenario to other variables that were changed, like demand and fuel prices, to try to optimize the best scenario for South Africa. Ultimately, they settled on a policy adjusted scenario, so not the least cost scenario. And so that's what this next graph shows. This is the policy adjusted scenario, and you'll see that most of the new generation is actually allocated to solar PV, wind, and gas projects, which account for 67% of the new projects to be built. And those new projects include both projects that have been committed in round 4 of the REI4P, as well as projects that have yet to be procured. And it's also helpful to see this graph because you can see that coal will still be a dominant source in South Africa by 2030. 12 gigawatts of the existing installed capacity will be decommissioned, but some new coal will still be built between now and 2030, mostly as part of the Medupi and Kusile projects, which are still under construction and have already been committed to. But there will be I think it's about a gigawatt of new coal to be procured by 2030 under this plan. In addition to the solar PV utility scale projects, there's also an embedded generation segment in this IRP, which allocates 200 megawatts a year for projects between 1 to 10 megawatts. And it's expected that quite a bit of that will go to solar PV as well as wind and potentially other resources. And there's also no nuclear in this policy adjusted approach. So that's also positive because people were worried that that was going to be much too expensive. So it's good to see that this Minister of Energy is more pragmatic. So there are still a number of issues that need to be resolved with this draft. And we're still going through the detail of it since it only came out yesterday. But people can submit comments to the government over the next 2 months. And then I think they're going to hopefully take some of those comments on board and readjust it. And maybe we'll see different allocations to some resources if they adjust their assumptions. Like, for example, solar PV, it looks like has pretty high assumptions for its cost at $1 per watt by 2050. And current market rates are already at that level in some locations. So there definitely needs to be some adjustment there. Also, there's a build limit placed on the renewable energy projects. So if you were to take that away, the actual share of renewables would probably be bigger than under this policy adjusted approach. And I've also seen some complaints from industry or questions about why they've capped the embedded generation segment at 200 megawatts a year. Some would argue that if a customer wants to generate their own electricity or build their own generation source, that the government shouldn't cap that. It should be up to the private sector to decide how fast that grows. But that's yet to be kind of decided on. And I'll stop there with the integrated resource plan because I know Pancho will pick up some other issues about it. And I'll move into the other market segments in terms of opportunity for growth in South Africa. So touching on the industrial, commercial, and residential market, which is mainly rooftop solar. The best way to understand this market segment is looking at municipal tariffs. And with over 200 municipalities across South Africa with their own tariff structures and tariff methodologies, it varies quite a bit by customer and location. In some locations, for example, solar PV is already cheaper for certain customers, depending on how much they're using and what customer category they fall under. Some municipalities also already offer an embedded generation tariff that you can opt into and apply to, so that encourages more people to install rooftop solar, for example, and sell excess electricity back to the municipality, usually at a reduced rate than what they buy. So this is a market segment that is growing with or without the finalization of the IRP. There are some NERSA regulations that will also influence this market segment, but for everything less than a megawatt, all those projects are exempt from licensing requirements from the regulator. And it looks like the new draft IRP doesn't cap any projects less than a megawatt. So this is a good opportunity as well for potential investors or developers if they're looking at opportunities here. Lastly, with the off-grid sector, South Africa has a pretty high electrification rate already, at over 80% or I think over 85% electrification. So the bigger market for the off-grid market is actually outside of South Africa, in East Africa and West Africa, and a lot of these companies here that you'll see, most of them are operating in East and West Africa. But there is still some opportunity for some customers that are looking at alternatives from the municipality or from Eskom if they're looking to go off-grid or looking for a more reliable source of electricity. There is still opportunity there as well. So in conclusion, there's a number of growth opportunities and new projects expected between now and 2030 in South Africa, both at the utility and smaller scale market. I think a minimum we could assume for the utility scale is 6.5 gigawatts. It's likely to be more if they take on board comments and potentially adjust the integrated resource plan scenarios. Also, we can expect to see some growth if the solar PV takes up a bigger segment of the embedded generation category as well. And lastly, to allow for the market growth that I think the solar PV wants to see, they have to work, in my view, alongside government to inform policy planning process and regulations that are needed. Because the private sector is most informed about the current market prices and future market prices and the direction that the industry is likely to go. So they need to work with government to help them be informed on these issues as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Belen.
Thank you very much, Chris. You actually were really short and sweet. I'm still reeling about the fact that the government has put a price in 2030, or was it 2050, that is actually at the level of today. That's very strange to me, especially in PV, because these days everyone seems to think that they're going to get paid for installing PV in a few years. So it's quite surprising to see that.
Yeah, it was good to see that they tried to account for it with a learning curve with current prices and decreasing by 2050, but I think they're very conservative in what they thought it would decrease by.
I mean, we're already talking about 1.7, at times we've even seen a project for, was it 2.54 in Egypt? So I think that this is definitely a curve on the way down. Okay, Pancho, your turn. I think Chris had agreed to put this table up. You're going to tell us about what this means, these numbers in the integrated resources plan. So please, if you could unmute yourself and just go for it.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Belen. My name is Pancho Ndebele. I've been involved primarily in concentrated solar power. We just building a 100 megawatt CSP right now. It's a parabolic trough with about 5 hours of storage. So it operates as a peaking plant. So it's one of the plants that is actually indicated if you see what's coming in 2019 under CSP in the graph that you can see, or the table you can see, is that, the 300 megawatt that they refer to as committed or already contracted, that relates to CSP. is that it belongs to 3 projects. One is basically the Redstone 100 megawatt solar tower that basically was just approved recently. And then the second part of that is the 100 megawatt NGCA 2 project that will also come on stream in 2019. And then the other one is the Ilanga project. What you see under CSP, there's already 300 megawatts of installed capacity. That installed capacity basically consists of 2 50 megawatt projects, one being a 50 megawatt parabolic trough, standard Spanish size project, which is basically the Bockbrook project that belongs to Aqua Power. And then you've got a 50 megawatt Ambergoa steam tower. And then the rest of the 2 parabolic troughs that relate to the already installed capacity for CSP are 200 megawatt parabolic troughs, both owned by Ambergoa. So I think what perhaps is a challenge for a lot of players in the CSP space is that when you look at the draft plan that's just come out, basically there isn't any CSP until perhaps after 2030, depending if CSP actually does exist in the South African market. And I think a lot of those things are driven by the modeling that is done and the costs that are done at the particular time when you're actually doing the modeling. And I think it applies across all technologies, as obviously also Chris was also indicating, because in my view, it's good to do all the modeling and look at least cost today, but least cost in a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 4 years' time, 5 years' time is going to be a different picture. So initially, a lot of people that commented on the 2016 IRP was that to do justice to the exercise, try and incorporate all technologies that were there in the IRP 2010. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, one doesn't know, for example, that if you had another bidding round tomorrow, where CSP will come in at. Will it break below the R1 mark? And so those are the kind of things from that perspective. So what you see basically in the draft that has come out, as also Chris indicated, you can see that there is going to be basically, there's already coal that is committed, predominantly deals with Kusile and Matupi, which are 2 large power stations, but also incorporated in there. There are 2 coal IPPs that have also sort of like been hanging around in the background that will be signed off and will be built as part of those integrated resource plan. So it's 2 coal-fired projects. I think one is a 300 megawatt, which also belongs to Aqua Power, and the other one is a 600 megawatt, which basically belongs to Marubeni. So there will be coal, potentially those are going to be the 2 coal IPPs from that perspective. All of you know that there has been a lot of debate around nuclear. As Chris has indicated, nuclear doesn't seem to have made the cut. But you know, all of us still need to read the IRP, because if you may remember that there was 9,600 megawatts of nuclear that was already a determination that existed, and it was part of the IRP 2010. So it'll be interesting to see when we actually read the documents a lot more further, what happens to some of the determinations that were passed by previous ministers to actually procure for certain technologies. Hydro is clear, that is to do with basically the large project out of the DRC, which is aimed at basically bringing in about 2,500 megawatts by 2030, and there's basically an agreement between South Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo in relation to that. On PV, Chris spoke eloquently on that. I won't touch on that. It's very clear also on wind where that is. And I think some of the questions that are already coming out is that, okay, what happens, for example, in the case of wind between 2022, 2023, 2024? There doesn't seem to be anything that gets procured at that particular point in time. The same happens with PV in relation to 2024 as well as 2025. you can see also that basically there's a huge shift and in terms of actually looking at gas becoming the game changer in the South African energy space. But you're also looking at basically that really coming on stream around 2026. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the infrastructure that needs to be put in place if we're actually going to become a gas player in the sector. You can then see basically other relates to biomass and landfill and etc. But I think one of the interesting things for me when we look at this is that many of you will know that there's a bid window in South Africa that was referred to as bid window 4.5. It was the expedited bid window. That window was actually canceled or basically, expired, according to the minister's comments, on the 1st of June when we had this energy stakeholder meeting. But they indicated in that there was going to be a bid window 5. And bid window 5, when you look at the documentation that was communicated after that particular stakeholder engagement, was that it was going to consist of similar technologies that you had in bid window 4.5. So if you look at if that message that was communicated at that point in time is the message and remains the message, that basically bid window 5, when it gets announced, which we anticipate is going to be November, the initial announcement when bid window 4.5 was canceled was that bid window 5 was going to have similar technologies as bid window 4.5. So what were the technologies in bid window 4.5? There was basically PV, there was wind, and there was CSP. So in a nutshell, we will also wait and see what happens when bid window 5 comes. Will CSP feature under bid window 5 based on the fact that the previous communication from the department was that bid window 5 was going to be made of similar technologies. And the other interesting part is that when you look at the already committed yellow megawatts, that predominantly deals with bid windows 1 to bid windows 4. It doesn't deal with anything to do with bid window 5. So I asked myself the question again to say, if we're going to have a bid window 5 in November, when are those megawatts that are going to be procured in bid window 5 come in? Surely they cannot come in the case of PV and wind in 2025. There will have to be basically a bid, and this can come in, i.e. maybe if they bid in next year in 2019, they have to come in on stream a lot more sooner than what perhaps we see as new additional capacity as per the IRP. So I guess for me, when I look at this, I think there's key 2 takeouts that I look at. One is the fact that, when you look at the fact that bid window 4.5 was canned, we're talking about bid window 5 coming in, and where are those megawatts? Are we going to have all the same technologies? And what is the timing in terms of when they need to come in on stream? Is it 2022? Is it 2021? Or is it 2023? So I think, there are all those things that need to be understood a lot more in depth in order to actually understand where we're actually going with this new plan as per se. I think for me, obviously, part of the comments, which is very good that it's been issued as a draft, because usually and everybody was going to be given about 30 days to comment. They've been given an additional 30 days, which is basically better 2 months. I think, it offers perhaps people the opportunity to share some of their insights and then to see basically whether the department will take some of the comments and actually have some adjustments. I don't see quite a lot of adjustments actually coming through, but I think if they're actually valid comments, particularly around pricing, that, you can have modeling today around least cost and then you do the policy adjusted, but things may change 2 or 3 years down the line. in short, that's basically my conversation in relation to this.
Thank you very much, Pancho. Thank you very much, Chris. I would like to leave that up there a little bit because I have a feeling that some of the questions are going to be about this. And my question actually, just to start, and I know there is a bunch of questions, so don't worry, guys, we will go to this, but what is the need to be forecasting like some 12 years in advance? What will be needed, you know, sort of 10 years from now, 5 years from now, divided by technology? This is the part that I don't understand. Why give yourself the inflexibility when you could give yourself the flexibility just simply by purchasing by cost, by, you know, offsetting profile? I mean, what is the, it seems to me that this was the way that things were done maybe 5, 6 years ago, but I don't understand now why divide things by technology, not by other practicalities like price, offsetting profile, as I was saying. So I don't know whether either of you want to weigh in on this or, you know, whether it's even relevant, but I find that it's just really surprising in this day and age, particularly within renewables, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you raise a good point that the IRP process historically, if we were to use that same methodology, it's a bit outdated because the prices are changing so quickly, especially within solar and wind, that it's hard for policymakers to plan 10 years, 20 years in advance. It did sound like the Minister of Energy was open-minded to trying to build in some more flexibility, and he acknowledged that even beyond 2030, it was difficult to predict very much. So they tried to limit a lot of the IRP recommendations to 2030, up to 2030, not too far beyond that. And he also acknowledged that there does need to be some flexibility. I didn't see a lot of information in their assumptions for the cost of storage, and that's also something that I think they'll have to factor in for future flexibility.
I was just going to say, I am gobsmacked because in all of the plans that I've read, including the Spanish plan, you know, they were saying, oh, you know, contract 47,000 megawatts of PV. And then they were like, and you'll fix it with storage. You know, batteries will be cheap by then. But there was no thinking behind it. It was just like, oh, just throw some batteries, it'll be fine. But so it is an integral part of a lot of the it'll be fine planning, but there is nothing here about batteries. I'm really surprised, actually. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether either of you want to wade into this.
Yeah, I think, Belen, if I can perhaps say is that, look, we've always had this framework of how we develop the IIP plan. I think in some instances, what you're saying, perhaps the way we're doing it is now outdated and we have to look at things perhaps differently. But I guess it's the question that if you come out with new approaches, how long is it going to take you to actually put something in place? And I think as a country, we've been under pressure to actually give some kind of certainty to the market in terms of where we're actually going. And so I think, you know, it just became like, listen, we need to actually get a few things on the go and see what happens. I haven't read the full plan that's come out, but if you remember previously, the whole idea was that the integrated resource plan needs to be updated every 2 years. And when we had the IIP 2010, you know, it's only actually being updated today. So whether that caveat of updating every 2 years is in this new draft IIP, I don't know, because I haven't read it in detail. And if it's built in that, you know, you can review it every 2 years and we actually stick to the timelines, then you are bound to see some changes actually happen. But if there's no element of reviewing it every 2 years, it's what it is. But I think for me, what is key, like when you're asking, is very simple. I'll give an example. The IIP 2010 was actually modeled around the same approach. And many of you will recall that when South Africa actually started the process at that particular point in time, the cost of CSP and PV, or the tariff that was capped to bid for CSP and PV, was the same. You know, and the round one PV projects that came in were even more expensive than the allocation that was there for CSP. But then I think what actually helped as you introduce a competitive bidding process, for me, is that basically the cost of that you use today, the moment you introduce a competitive bidding process, it's been proven that all the projects we have today, none of them were actually bid at what was the cost used for modeling. They were way, way, way lower. So to your kind of like remark, Belen, for me, when I look at it, I say that, you know, if you really wanted to drive the market and create opportunities for all technologies, you run a procurement process and you say, I am going to be bidding X megawatts this year. All the private guys bid, give me what you got, and I can see who actually comes in cheap. So you'll probably find, as you've more or less reiterated, that by the time we start bidding the projects of PV and win the 670 megawatt for PV in 2025, the tariff will be totally different to what has been modeled today. And perhaps it will come with batteries and be even perhaps a lot more cheaper at that point in time. So that's the situation.
So I have at least, out of the 10 questions that I have here live and that I need to answer, Pancho, about half of them are, what is CSP? What is CSP? What are they doing with dispatchability? Why not CSP? Why have they forgotten about CSP after 2019? You know, it basically shows an end to CSP after 2019. And you explained, right, that this 4.5, that has to be sort of repeated. If I am not mistaken, it was a CSP only round? You mentioned different technologies.
It was, look, the bid win of 4.5 had 3 technologies. There might have also been a bit of biomass in it, but there was definitely PV, there was definitely wind, but the CSP allocation for that particular round was 450 megawatts. Okay. So if you look at the original IIP 2010, it had an allocation of CSP of about 1,200 megawatts. Okay. So if you look at it, and I am hopeful that, you know, if bid window 5 comes in and the Department of Energy sticks to the fact that it's safe that, you know, it will have similar technologies as it was in 4.5, that perhaps we may see some bidding in relation to the CSP. But obviously, what is more concerning is from where I sit and having been one of the people involved in CSP, is that I think we still face perhaps a little bit of misunderstanding of the value proposition that another renewable source that has potentially got storage, dispatchability capabilities, and the possibility of even doing base load is not featuring. But bear in mind that at the end of the day, initially everything is based on least cost, and the assumptions, and which I think the CSP industry still needs to do, is to push and drive this cost downwards. So if you start to look at maybe what is happening in Dubai, and my question is that, you know, what is the cost of the modeling that we used? We actually looked at what is current, what we see in the market, and because I'm of the view, as much as I understand, take for example, in bid window 5, I understand that the cheapest CSP came in close to about 1 Rand 10. And, you know, that is close to actually getting to below the 1 Rand mark. And perhaps if you have bid window 5, that could be the case. And you may find that, you know, with its dispatchability capabilities, it may add value. So I think there still has a lot of engagement that the CSP community needs to do to actually demonstrate the value proposition, and lastly, to actually make sure that you drive costs downwards in order to ensure that, you know, CSP has a part to play. And one last point, for example, I believe that if you remember, Chris, there was in the draft IP 2016 discussions around the cost of batteries and et cetera, that could potentially be linked to PV or to wind, et cetera. I'm of the view that maybe if we were to take a PV today with battery, and then you also look CSP today with its storage, probably you're becoming on par in terms of, what is the cost from that perspective. So I think, when I look at it is that maybe if you had CSP without storage, where would it come in? I'm not saying that's what should be the case, but you can never compare and look at this because we're not looking at apples to apples in many cases.
Absolutely. The question is whether they value that dispatchability side of CSP. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything, or you're very pensive in there. I'm wondering, my 2 pennies for your thoughts.
No, I think Pancho covered the CSP background pretty well. My only comment that I might add is, I think if you're going to open up CSP to having some preferential treatment for storage and that storage benefit, you should just open that up for all technologies, for solar as well, to be able to offer battery storage with solar PV.
What is fair, right? I looking at these numbers, I just look at what says there, gas, diesel in 2026, and I just think that should be for CSP or for solar with storage. I'm like, shh, and then put it forward 5 years. Okay, let's see. We have some question here. So I don't really understand this question, but I think it's because I don't understand what embedded generation really is. But it says, how will the embedded generation component implement solar PV projects greater than 10 megawatts in South Africa? Either of you wants to take this question?
Sure. So the embedded generation as it's defined within the draft IRP is 1 to 10 megawatts. So projects that are bigger than 1 megawatt, but less than 10 megawatts. So solar above 10 megawatts, I think would fall outside of that, and it would have to be covered under the utility scale PV column, which is in the middle of this table here.
Okay, there's another one for you as well. Can you please emphasize on the opportunities for ground-mounted megawatt scale projects, or let us know business opportunities in South Africa? It's a bit generic, but I'm sure that you talked about off-grid and grid, so I'm sure there's something you can add here.
Yeah, I think ground-mounted also falls under the embedded generation if it's 1 to 10 megawatts. That's how they're limiting it. They're open to any technology type, whether it's ground-mounted, PV, fixed tilt, but it depends on the scale is how they're categorizing it. So even for the utility scale projects, those mostly will all be ground-mounted, and some will be tracking, some won't. It just depends on the bidders and the developers.
So here's someone, Paul says, in the IRP plan for the period ending in 2030, we understand that the next round will be for plants online in 2025. Exactly what you were saying earlier, actually, Pancho. There is a little bit of a jump there, not before. So he's asking, whether you're expecting round 5 to happen in 2022. I know that Pancho already discussed this a little bit, but maybe you can go in more depth.
Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, as I indicated, there was an announcement, public announcement by the Minister of Energy on the 1st of June of this year, that he indicated that we were canning bid window 4.5, and we're going to have bid window 5, and that bid window 5 will be announced or more or less in November of this year. So I think, my anticipation is that, that is something that I believe should actually go forward. But obviously, as I indicated earlier, we also need to understand it in the context of the draft IIP that sits in front of us. Because as already indicated, you cannot run a competitive bidding process, let's say in 2019, and then expect those projects to come on stream in 2025. So there has to be something that actually comes in on stream, depending on the lead times for building the projects, depending on technologies, around basically 2021, 2022. So I anticipate that is probably what's going to happen, but let's wait and see. There's going to be a lot of discussions and a lot of comments, I think, coming out of this.
My thinking here, you know, I see this 44% or 45% mix of coal. You know, I know a lot of it is already being committed, but I think it's quite large considering I know that you guys are signants of the COP21. I mean, is this in line with the 2-degree, you know, that they're talking about, or is it a bit like Australia has decided to turn around and walk in a different direction? Who wants to take it? Chris is switched off and gone, I don't want to go down this road.
Look, I can look, I mean, I think Chris had touched on this earlier on. I mean, if you look at it, the coal that we have there, the committed ones, it already deals with basically Matupi, Kusile that are already on the go. And, you know, some of the units relation to those power stations have been commissioned and etc. So we're talking about a capacity that is already committed and was procured a long time ago. The only new coal that you see there is basically to do with the 2 IPPs, okay, more or less, that where I think we're bid around bid window 3, and they still need to actually conclude that. So what you see in this is that you're only going to have 1,000 megawatts of new coal in the next 12 years. And the bulk of what we have is actually existing infrastructure. So that's really what it is from my side. I don't know.
Of course. I mean, but Pancho, most of the countries, you know, that are looking at also taking those offline, you know, the old plants, you know, there is a little bit of a renovation going on. So it's not just adding, but it's also replacing. But I understand, you know, where you're coming from. I mean, you have 39 right now. You end up with 33. So you end up with even less, but you're still, you know, adding some more on. I understand. I mean, 2030 is actually around the corner when you think about it. In terms of infrastructure planning, it's nothing. We have an extra 2 questions. Luis, our good friend Luis Pancho, says it's not a question of value proposition, how to advance in a CO2-free generation system with renewables. Now CSP could offer better prices than gas to cover the time when the sun is not shining. I don't disagree. We'll have to look at the prices of gas. And then someone else here, Anonymous, says, how do we deal with the declining sales in declining electricity sales when we're replacing cheap coal capacity with more expensive renewables? It sounds like a downward spiral of demand and increasing prices. I suppose this is an important point that we need to make. We don't know how people in the audience are, you know, familiar with renewables. Question for the 2 of you: can we today have cheaper renewables in South Africa even than coal? Or can we in 2 years? So I don't know, maybe you can have your own opinion, you know, as well as to how would you manage to take this matrix, make it more renewable and cheaper for everybody? Is this possible? Is this crazy? Who wants to take it? Chris, go. Sure.
Well, they did run that scenario actually for the least cost scenario, and that was another IRP option. They chose this one, which is the policy adjusted, but the least cost scenario actually had coal coming in more expensive than the PV, wind, and gas mix, which was the main mix within that. So even under current prices, we're already seeing renewables is cheaper than new coal. And also, just to add to that previous question a little bit more, I think if you want to see a faster phase out of coal, I mean, it's still over 80% of the installed capacity in South Africa. You have to have some strong political will to phase that out quicker, and some aggressive goals to be set from the top. Neighboring countries here, like Namibia, have set a 70% renewable goal by 2030. So they have ambitious plans to meet renewable energy targets. I think South Africa is taking more of a middle of the road approach, trying to keep people from all sectors happy, which isn't as progressive when you're trying to meet climate change goals.
Okay, and Pancho, do you have anything to add here? Can you make it cheaper than coal?
No, look, I think Chris answered it, that they ran some least cost scenarios. And then, you know, always in the case of South Africa, you have to do a policy adjusted scenario because, you know, as indicated, we have a lot of coal in abundance, and there are certain areas that people feel that, you know, those industries still needs to exist. And also what you see and what I've heard, for example, around, you know, looking at gas going forward is the possibility of trying to retrofit some of those coal-fired power stations in the future, given the fact that, you know, most of the gas resources that we are looking at tapping into outside South Africa, bringing in, you know, gas pipelines that are running in from Mozambique and coming in. So part of looking at this, even when you see a huge chunk of gas, it's got the policy approach of the government to say, how do we actually co-develop and work within the region and open up opportunities for gas in the region, for hydro in the region, etc. But you raise one important thing, Belen, is that, you know, in the preparation and the commenting of the IIP, one of the things that was clear and what a lot of people were saying is that, you know, the role CSP plays is that also of a flexible generator. That by putting in gas, we are actually saying we want flexible generation. And that ultimately, at the end of the day, CSP can play that role of a flexible generator alongside gas. And we think those are some of the things that, you know, perhaps the policymakers haven't understood to actually have a balanced approach. Because I think what, for me, in a certain extent, for example, when you look at what Luis, our friend, was asking, is that you've already deployed 600 megawatts of a technology such as a CSP. There are skills that have been developed in the country. There are manufacturing facilities that we're producing certain components. Basically, what you're doing also, you are more or less shutting down the possibility of that industry. So if we're looking at policy adjusted also has to look at some of those things from a job creation standpoint, what is already there in order to actually make sure that, you know, you create win-win, just as we've done, for example, if you look at coal, as Chris said, is that what you see with coal is a clear policy adjustment to actually make sure that coal remains relevant to cater for certain sectors. And I think the same should be fair across the board.
Thank you very much, Pancho and Chris. I just have a final question before we say goodbye, and it's like, what are the key dates to watch for? You mentioned, you know, there is still a consultation period, then this will close. Do we know the key dates that we need to watch out for? When do we need to do another webinar, essentially?
Maybe Pancho knows better than I do, but I know that these comments have to be submitted within 2 months. So we have 2 months to get back to the government Department of Energy with our feedback. And then after that, I don't actually know the rest of the timeline, but round 5 will likely be pushed out if it follows this procurement plan, because like Pancho said, procuring that capacity by 2025, they wouldn't have the procurement round until closer to that date when they have to build it.
So,
yeah, so Chris is right. You got 2 months, and I think it's going to depend what is the level of the comments coming through and how long then the department will have time to actually do the necessary adjustments if it needs to be. So I wouldn't actually, the only timeline I know now is that it's 60 days as of yesterday. That's all you have to actually comment. What happens beyond that, I absolutely got no clue.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you've got 59 days to make your comments. So if you have any comments, take a look at the document and send your comments. And thank you very much, and Chris and Pancho, for being here. We do wish that, you know, this gets resolved in a good way for renewable energy industry. I think the South African industry was created in those, you know, past few years. Companies like Pancho's creating a lot of jobs, a lot of local jobs. It would be a real shame to miss out, you know, on this growing going forwards. So I hope, you know, that, you know, there is opportunities, you know, whether it's for, you know, doing things in South Africa or also even exporting. So just like to say, we'll check back with you in a couple of months and hope that everything is for the better and the draft gets adjusted. Thank you very much, and see you in the next one. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye.